Thanks very much for the invitation to be here with you and to listen to these people who know much more than I do about this. So I would like to start by paying homage to two very important people in the development of my life. The one on the left is Dick Easterlin, for those of you who don't know, who recently celebrated his retirement from teaching. He's still carrying on as a researcher. He's 93. And on the right is, of course, the fantastic Ian Dury and the Blockheads, who are responsible for the title of this talk. I need the clicker. Did Philippe walk off with it? Did he sell it? How much is this worth to you, Philippe? Come on. Embodiment of new technology. So we've broadly got three ways of knowing whether individuals or societies are doing well. We can base ourselves on revealed preferences, and we all know how to do that. As economists, looking at the role of resources, prices and preferences to say something about the satisfaction of wants, we can make up lists of valuable outcomes or capabilities, functionings, a la Human Development Index or Sen or Martha Nussbaum's work in this area. Or we can actually listen to what people say about their own lives. So I'm just briefly going to talk about those in turn. Now, as Didier has himself written, and if you don't write this, don't say anything, okay, about revealed preferences, I mean, behaviour is good because it's observable, and we love things that are observable in economics. We like looking at what people do. But one problem is that you can't actually make statements about welfare from observed choice behaviour without knowing about preferences. And since we sort of don't really know about preferences, it's actually rather difficult to make rankings of individuals in welfare terms just by looking at what they do, because it depends on how you then put what they do into their individual utility function to say whether they're doing better or not than each other. And, of course, something very banal to say in this sense, and you've heard that already a number of times, is that not all of the things that we care about are exchanged in markets and have prices, so it's hard to think of revealed preferences in that sense. Now, multidimensional lists are extremely attractive and I think quite unsatisfactory, unfortunately. They're paternalistic, they're top-down, you're deciding what matters for other people, and who says that you know anything about that. We never know when to stop adding things to them. How much is enough? Is it 3, as in HDI? Is it 40, as in some capabilities lists I've seen? Or is it indeed 250 or some other number? We don't know, and we will never know. Even if we did know, how do we add them up? How much is a year of healthy living worth to you in terms of your children's education? You don't know. You don't know, and I don't know, and we can't really do that. Sorry, I'm in this direction, aren't I? Okay. Right, so we don't know what weights to use. And even if we did know the weights, we need to know each individual's specific particular weight in order to calculate welfare, because the sum of BIXI is not equal to B average times X average, as we know. So you can get round some of these problems in the last two by actually not using any weights at all. So this is the Millennium Development Goals approach. You have a kind of traffic light tableau de bord approach where you have different colours, red, amber, green for the different things we care about. And okay, fine, but that is completely useless in a welfare sense. The only welfare statement you can make in a tableau de bord is Pareto dominance. And that is practically a useless thing to know. We never have Pareto dominance, so why do we even talk about that? Right, so the last one, and this is the one I prefer, of course, which is why I was invited here to be beaten up by the theorists, is subjective well-being. And I'll motivate that with this great quote from, I think, one of the best economics writers we have economics writers who are sort of professors. Alan Blinder. Alan was talking about price-setting behaviour some 20 years ago, if molecules could talk or chemists refused to listen. So let's actually ask the people who are doing this stuff about how well they think they're living their lives. Here are 2 sample questions: life satisfaction that you find absolutely everywhere these days, and then this rather differently phrased Cantril self-anchoring ladder that Angus likes a lot, that appears in the Gallup World Poll. Now, apart from all of that, here's one reason why I really like subjective well-being measures. Economics has become behavioural, or rather it hasn't really, but we now say it has. It's still the same things we always used to talk about. And we worry about things like people not actually knowing what they want. People don't have fixed preferences. They don't really know what their preferences are. And in that case, you can miswant. You can buy stuff you don't really want. Linked to that, you can mispredict. You adapt. You get used to what you have. That big house in the countryside is very good, but not for very long, actually. It becomes the new norm. And as a rather clever psychologist, David Myers, wrote, the secret to happiness is not having what you want, but wanting what you have, which is quite clever when you think about it, actually. Well, I liked it. And lastly, we have spillovers. And Philippe's, you've heard he has quite a number of jobs these days. So he's used that to buy a very large new car. I don't know if you know that. And so Philippe's new Mercedes makes him really happy because he's a very conspicuous consumption kind of guy. But it actually kind of pisses me off because, you know, it makes my Honda Civic look crappy. So those are 3 kinds of things: miswanting, mispredicting, and spillovers. Now, the problem in terms of measuring welfare is that revealed preference will not pick up any one of those 3. It's just not there. So if you adapt to something, it doesn't matter. You bought it, it goes into GDP, fine. You won't pick up adaptation, and you won't pick up spillovers, the fact that your consumption behaviour actually makes me feel less well off. Neither will multidimensional lists, but well-being does. If your happiness changes, we're going to pick it up because that's exactly what we're measuring. And here are a couple of examples of using well-being data to pick up exactly these kinds of behavioural phenomena. This one from Erzo Lutmer's Neighbours as Negatives paper in the QJE some 13 years ago now, showing relative income mattering, and then one of my pieces about 10 years ago now, showing adaptation to marriage. So marriage is a very good idea for up to about 12 months, and then you kind of get used to it. Right, so, oh look, there's a little dotty thing. Okay, right, so in addition to all of that, satisfaction questions are incredibly simple. They take up seconds in a questionnaire. It's not a complicated construct in some level. And because they're simple, non-response is negligible. So I went to the Wave 18 of the BHPS yesterday, as you do on a Sunday, to look at non-response rates. So the non-response rate to life satisfaction in Wave 18 of the BHPS is 1%, 1.1%. The non-response rate to a question asked of workers, what is your usual monthly pay, is around 10%. People either don't know or they refuse to tell you. We get much better measurement in that sense with well-being. Now, that's all fine if well-being is what really matters. And as Richard Layard likes to say, well-being is the only variable that you or I or even Philippe can think of that's not instrumental. So why do you go to work? Well, because it's fun and because you get money, right? Why do you want money? To buy things. Why do you want to buy things? Well, because I feel good, I feel happy when I have these things. So why do you want to feel happy? You know, it does not compute 404. What the hell? You know, I can't answer that because it's not instrumental. It's my entire valuation process. And happiness is important for people, and we can see that in the sense that people will leave dissatisfying situations in order to go to satisfying ones. And here's another example of that kind of process. This is the rationality of divorce. Where people are becoming less and less happy. This is panel data within subject analysis. Becoming less and less happy within their marriage, they divorce and then actually end up happier. So this is people shifting away from unsatisfactory to satisfactory situations. Okay, let me finish with reasons not to be cheerful, because of course, yeah, we all agree that well-being is better than everything else. I think that's, I mean, it's an évidence quand même, no? And here are some reasons why we might, you know, we might come into some difficulties. The scales are bounded. You're dealing with 0 to 10 or 1 to 7, and once you get to 10, you can't get anywhere else. You can't go up any more. What happens when we're all at 10? Now, practically, most people aren't at 10 and they're not at 7. Only relatively few people are stuck in the top category, and all of our analyses are actually robust to the exclusion of the top category. So that's kind of fine. Reporting style, I use language in a different way to you, and you use language in a different way to other people, and so on. So is my 7 the same as your 7, or are we thinking about different constructs here? Now, one thing to say is if my 7 was different from your 7, I could never predict any individual behaviour using cross-sections of well-beings. As it happened, if I asked all of you your happiness level at the moment, and I corrected for age, I could actually have a pretty good stab at estimating life expectancy amongst you. People die according to their happiness scores, okay? And that's true in a cross-sectional sense. Therefore, there must be some kind of information in that report. Okay, I don't know, I'm not going to take up very much longer, actually. I don't think we need to compare across countries. Most policies are national. We don't need to look at Belgium and compare it to Greece in order to make statements about optimal policy in a well-being sense. Yeah, am I done? I am done. Okay, this is actually my last 2 points. The embarrassment of riches is there's not only one well-being measure, there are many. Life satisfaction, affect, and eudaimonia are 3, and we would try to see how closely these are related and which is a better predictor of behaviour. My absolute last point is I've been talking about happiness, average life satisfaction. I don't think we should care about that so much. In the same way we don't care about average GDP per capita only. We care about social welfare. The distribution of individual incomes is the input into the social welfare function. I think the distribution of individual happiness should be the input into the happiness social welfare function. And when you do that, you start getting some quite interesting results. We all know that higher GDP per capita doesn't raise average happiness. That's kind of known in a number of countries. What is much less well known is that higher GDP per capita shrinks the variance of happiness, and that's something we should find valuable in a kind of social welfare sense. Okay, I'm done. Thank you very much. Thanks.
All right, good afternoon. I will try and hark back a little bit to what Didier said and actually touch upon some of the things that came through in the various presentations as well. If I look at the top policy areas that are being discussed at the OECD now, there are 3 of them, and they are right on target in terms of what we've been discussing here. Digitalisation, what are the impacts for productivity, for the future of work? Globalisation, who is being left behind, how does it play out in countries' competitiveness, and well-being more generally is a policy target. And all of these have measurement implications, and I will start giving you 3 challenges concerning digitalization. The first one was measured already in terms of getting quality changes right that come through with new products, typically of a digital nature. Under quality change, I would subsume also this issue of bringing new products quickly into the price index so that we capture the early price changes. This is also something here that Didier said, this is actually the intersection where production measurement and welfare measurement meets for the reason that was already mentioned, namely that if we want to construct a cost of living index, we are always reasoning in terms of keeping utility constant and looking at price changes at the time. So we can't quite escape this idea of separating production and welfare. But I'd also like to sort of throw in a few buts in this debate. The first one is that it is not always obvious what the price and the quantity actually is that we want to observe. So we have to be very careful about the units that we choose, and not every byte that is downloaded is necessarily a unit of volume supplied. And I think there is a lot of basic discussions that need to be had in order to get prices and quantities right conceptually before we actually go out measuring, because there's a big temptation just observing the volume of data that's being shipped around and say, oh, this is all quantity that you consume. Things are a little more complicated than that. Second thing is there is a priori, and rightly probably, that the welfare effects associated with digitalization are typically positive. Okay, but we also know that there are some negative effects, and I don't think we should forget about these when we think about bringing welfare into our quality change adjustments for price deflators. Thirdly, we shouldn't leave sort of the overall perspective of where digital products fit in our whole economy. If you look at household consumption, 2/3 of household consumption are still about food, housing, and clothes. So areas where the digitalization comes in, yes, with new varieties and so, but still we need to make choices about where to put our statistical dollar. And there are many areas, for example, housing, real estate prices, where a lot of effort needs to be spent that is a little bit independent of the whole debate about digitalization. Challenge number 2, free products, that was already mentioned here. Theory doesn't have actually a great deal of guidance here. We are always in a world where we have some sort of environmental variables that are free, and part of our utility function and how much we should bring into a price index and how much we should leave out is a question of appreciation. The other thing is, of course, with digital free products, it is very often the case that free is only something that appears to be on the surface. At the end of the day, a free app that you download is being paid for by an implicit transaction, in the sense that you watch the advertisement that comes up or you give away your data that you generate by using the app. And we need to think about how to translate this into our transaction-based model. The third area was also mentioned already, is what is the scope of production, what is the scope of GDP that we want to bring in. By convention, this is mostly the monetary transactions that are carried out in the economy. And we certainly need to think about the things that Diane was alluding to in terms of all this digital innovation that happens within households and that is being produced. But then there is this very basic question: if we consider those new forms of productions within households, what do we do with the old forms of production within households? Childcare, care of the elderly. Here's a little picture. In the US, there are 15 million Alzheimer patients that are being treated at home. This is a massive service that is provided outside GDP. If you put a money value to it, you get, your GDP increases by 10% maybe. So we need to make very fundamental choices of what it is we want to have inside the boundary and what it is that we don't want to have inside. The answer to this is really, what is the question, what is the answer? What sort of measure do we want that is fit for use for a particular purpose? The second area, which is the MM3 that Didier alluded to, is globalization. The challenge really here arises in the area where globalization meets digitalization. And we already pointed to this phenomenon where intangible assets, intellectual property products that are undeniably true sources of capital services, of competitiveness for companies, for countries, change borders. With a mouse click, you can send an asset from one country to the next. You have assets that simultaneously provide capital services in different establishments, in different countries. How do we get our input measures right in the economy? And how do we allocate income to these services? How do we avoid confusing income with pure profits when we look at this? And I mean, this goes in the direction that you mentioned, Philippe, and when we look at the GAFAs and margins and competitiveness. We think that one way to go, but of course this will take time, is to try and construct accounts for multinational enterprises that cut across national boundaries. In many ways, this would imply information exchange between national statistical offices, which is an extremely complicated process. There are efforts now at the European level to do this, but you can imagine the issues of the legal, institutional issues that arise with exchange of microdata on individual companies. The third area is about monitoring well-being more generally. The OECD has now actually, for the past 10 years or so, heavily invested in coming up with the scoreboard, if you want, of indicators that cut across quality of life dimensions. Something that Andrew was not very positive about just a moment ago. And it's true, of course, one can talk about aggregation of those. I have some ideas on that. But whatever the sort of theoretical criticism is, this is a really, really useful tool to get engagement with policymakers to think above and beyond GDP. If you tell them, well, we need also to think about health, education, about life-work balance. And when you define policies, don't just think in a sectoral way, but think how those can be combined. Then that in itself, we find, is a useful, enough reason to construct those indicators. It's also a way of pointing to something that we think is increasingly important, that is inequalities. Inequalities not only in income, which is the sort of most common way of talking about this, but between regions. You have massive inequalities between regions, and of course gender inequalities across all these dimensions that we can observe. Here this is sort of opening up a field of statistical work, and again, partially in some of these areas the answer, the problem is part of the solution. I mean, the digital world also offers massive opportunities to get more granular, more timely data and to address some of those issues. Or tapping into administrative sources is something that is still vastly underexploited in many countries. Time use surveys was mentioned today as a way of getting at household production. in a much better way. And I throw in environment economy accounting because the environment was not something that was mentioned very strongly today. And one can think about how to construct new aggregates in this context. I'll finish with a word from the late Tony Atkinson, who gave a talk a couple of years ago at the OECD. And he said, if you look through a keyhole, you only get a very partial perspective on what goes on inside the house. And it's the same with statistics. The best we can do is to cross several perspectives to know more of what is going on inside the house. And I think that's a very insightful and pragmatic way of looking at this issue. What is the question? What is the answer that we want to get measurement for? Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Paul, and thank you for having come back to Didier's questions. Due to the lack of time, just two remarks from my side. First, I think that we have three very different issues. MM1, MM2, MM3. I mean, GDP versus welfare, quantities and prices, overestimation of price, underestimation of growth, and the third issue, which is the globalization and what is domestic, as Didier said in the very beginning. I don't know if it's helpful to. It's very challenging to deal with the three issues at the same time, and I don't know if it's helpful to use, for instance, to subjective well-being, in order to help us to know if we are underestimating growth or not. And I'm a little bit frustrated that we cannot get the three issues meet in a way. Well, let's have some questions. We just have 5, maybe 10 minutes left. Diane, I know you have to leave quickly. So, if questions? Questions for Diane first, if you have, but questions anyway, for everybody. And yes.
It's on the GDP indicator. I listened to you all about the difficult question of how to measure the prices and so then the impact on growth. So my question is about nominal GDP. Because nominal GDP is much easier to measure, actually. And I wonder whether we should not use more and more nominal GDP. For taxation, the tax base is not real GDP, it's nominal GDP, so it's perfect. Debt to GDP is nominal GDP. And for fiscal policy, there is more and more discussion on replacing things like structural deficits by nominal expenditure rules, things like that. So it's nominal, and it needs to be confronted to something that is also nominal. And even for monetary policy, people are discussing nominal GDP targets. So I wonder whether your discussion one possible outcome of your discussion would be to use more heavily nominal GDP as compared with real GDP.
But what about welfare?
Well, my immediate reaction would be that, yes, nominal GDP is useful for quite a few purposes, and you've mentioned some of them, but somehow it's hard to get away from the idea that you want to separate the movements in prices and quantities. If you look at this GDP thing over time, or indeed if you look at it in space, you see. We have this purchasing power parities between countries, but even within a country, a euro in Paris doesn't have the same worth as a euro somewhere in the center of France or in the south of Italy. You have a different price level from what you observe in Milan. So this idea that you want to get at real values because they tell you something about your purchasing power is, I think, very central to the idea of either measuring production or measuring welfare in one way or the other.
No, I think you're right that governments are much better at measuring nominal values than real values. But for example, what would you make of inflation target then? So then inflation target, you do away with that. So you would change monetary policy and just no more inflation target. So that's an interesting idea. I will say it comes from you, because I will, why not? But it's true also that, you know, if you are interested in, so you could say, well, for macroeconomic purpose, I would use nominal, and otherwise I go directly to welfare measures, and I don't do real. And still, I mean, I think there is some value, and I think what's something that you mentioned, that Andrew mentioned in his talk, and you mentioned, is that there's been the studies showing that it's true that real GDP growth, for example, per capita GDP growth doesn't say, you know, everything. But if you look at measure of life satisfaction or variance, and you had the study by Kenman and Deaton, you see some correlation with per capita GDP and life satisfaction value. So it's interesting. And the work that we did even with the Angus in a paper on creative destruction and subjective well-being, which is in the ER now, and we looked. We could decompose. We could say, well, creative destruction, it implies you lose jobs, but you create values and you create growth. And you could see that very well. You could see that it increases worry. You know, you ask people about worry, but it increases also life satisfaction, particularly in sectors where you have less outsourcing or better growth prospects. So you can, in fact, you see, link various, I mean, you can use pretty much standard models to interpret studies involving surveys, you know, on various aspects of happiness, in fact. So and link them to either GDP per capita or growth in per capita GDP. It doesn't mean that it's exhaustive, but it's not totally irrelevant to have the per capita GDP real, and it conveys some information, not all the information, but some.
But to answer Agnès, we unfortunately need prices. Wage negotiations, welfare, public policies, and so on and so on. And our worry is that it's increasingly difficult to locate the values that value themselves. That's the globalisation. That's MM3, and that's really a big concern. Other questions, please. Yes.
Thank you. I have two questions, actually, one for Andrew Clark and one for Philippe Aghion. So the question for Andrew Clark is that, so you say you rely on what people say, but I think, so what we would really like to know is not if people are happy or not, but what would make them more happy, to know what can we do. And I think this is not a question that is usually asked in questionnaires, so it's probably why you don't study this directly, but only indirectly by regressions. So would you like to see such questions in questionnaires? And the question for Philippe Aghion is, in the list of reasons for stagflation, I was surprised that you didn't mention environmental and energy issues. Like, for example, Robert Harris, resource economist, pretends that the total productive factors can be explained by oil and other hydrocarbons that are that we'll have to make without them in the future, and with probably much scarcer sources of energy. Could that be linked to stagflation?
Well, Andrew, are there cases where subjective well-being has been useful for public policies?
Perhaps just if there is a question for Diane Coyle, because she's going to leave.
Okay, is well-being useful for public policy? That's a leading question, if ever I heard one. Yeah, I think it has been. I think we're able to calculate the value of natural goods, for example, things like parks, things like clean water. I think we have a very good idea of how much pollution is worth because we've got some careful analysis using causal changes in pollution on well-being, of how much having a clean environment is worth. And just putting prices on things is it's a useful thing to know because it gives us a ranking of stuff we should be doing, which actually comes to your question. For the moment, we establish that ranking by running multivariate regressions, either in cross-section or panel, and looking at what, in some sense, what variable has the largest beta in a standardized sense, which matters the most. What we don't do, and this is probably our economics tradition, is actually ask people, so what would you need to be happier? It would be a great question to put in. We generally don't have it. There always is a question in the SOEP, which has been analysed by Gert Wagner and other people. What do you worry about? What are things that aren't working in your life? What are the problems you think you have? And you reply in a sort of free text sense and then use textual analysis to pick out the top however many things there are. I think that's terribly useful information which will complement the cross-sectional or panel regression analysis.
Just very brief, because I know there may be other question. So also on the to complete Andrew has fully answered the first question. On life satisfaction, we know that, for example, question, where do you lie on a scale between 0 and 10? But there is also another question, where do you think you will lie in 5 years? And will you be better in 5 years? Do you think you'll be better than today? So that you can use. So on the growth thing, the creativity structure, we see that where you have high growth prospects, you will see more positive correlation between creative destruction implying growth on the one hand and future life satisfaction. You see the expected life satisfaction, even more than the current. So that goes a bit in the direction that you are suggesting. So you can already, with the question that I asked, go some way, I mean, on this. On the energy, I think you're right. I mean, one thing is to look at TFP growth and thing, and one thing is to look at innovation itself. So there have been a number of studies now looking at of course, the problem is the metrics. On innovation, we don't have much. We have patents, and patents is just a small part. But you have very good metrics on patents. So you can look at the generality of patent, or highly cited, not highly cited, and you can look at more green, less green. So for example, we have done some work with Von Rienen and other co-authors who are looking at green innovation. And so you may want to ask, what would favor? Would carbon tax, would this, would that favor green? And it does, actually. It redirects technical change. Direct technical change works in the empirics. And you see that when you have higher carbon tax, but it influences people to do more green innovation. So I think you can look at other measures than TFP growth, directly innovation or creation of firms, and then associate them being clean or not less clean, and our classification. So you can go some way in that direction.
I just wanted to add something on the environment and energy, because we do have a measurement issue there in conjunction with productivity as well. The reason being that when we measure multi-factor productivity and sort of look at the input side where we combine, labor and capital, typically what is included is only produced capital. What we do not include in our input bundle is natural resources and the quantity of natural resources that are coming out from under the soil or elsewhere. We account for the income, of course, but not necessarily for the quantity. So if those flows move slower than capital investment, produced investment, then you are actually making a misjudgment of your quantity change of inputs. In fact, you're overstating the flow of inputs. And if you account for that, you have a different profile of productivity measurement. This is something that was very prominent in a debate in Australia, where the mining industry in Australia basically showed no productivity growth. But one reason was that there was no account made for the iron ore that came actually out of the ground. And if you factored that in, the productivity growth was much better the measured productivity growth was much better in the Australian mining sector. And a similar idea applies to land. Okay, we do not normally include land in our input computations for productivity. And land is almost a fixed factor, so whenever you bring it in, you actually bring the growth rate of the overall inputs down and tend to increase the measured productivity growth. So I think there's a lot of things to say on environment, natural resources, and productivity measurement.
Other questions?
Yeah. If I come back on Didier Blanchet's question on the link between those measurement affairs and academic work, is there a link between the measurement of well-being, the studies in the measurement of well-being, and what is happening in the field of behavioral economics? Because they produce new types of facts, they produce of economic facts, which were not considered as economic facts a few years ago. They produce analysis of well-being, they produce analysis of behavior, of what types of politics through the nudge literature could be done. So is there a link between the two fields, and could this link help answering Didier Blanchet's question on a relationship between academic work in a totally different field than statistics or public policy and the questions we're dealing with today?
This one's working. Okay. We tend to think a lot of the ideas that we're working on come from behavioural econ, social comparisons and so on. I'm not sure if that's actually true. Social comparisons go all the way back to sociology. They go back to industrial relations. It's quite an old idea, actually. You can trace it back to Adam Smith, of course, like most things. But some of the things that we're working on that are big in behavioural econ, you can actually find the echo of them in well-being data. Loss aversion, you can find that in well-being. It's not just a laboratory phenomenon. You can actually find it in real-world panel data. When people go down by $100, they have a bigger drop in well-being than they do when they go up by $100, and that's systematic. Things like nudge. Why does nudge work? It's because we don't like choice, actually. Choice is a stressful thing. It's complicated, it's threatening, we don't know what the hell we're doing. You can show in the lab that people don't like choice, you can show in data people actually dislike choice, which of course is why nudge works, because you get someone choosing for you and you can manipulate the choice that they make. Otherwise we would all just go to our preferred option out of the 15 pensions that are offered to us. But of course we don't actually know anything about them. We want to be guided in that. We do not want choice there, and that's, I think, quite a general phenomenon. Which makes me wonder whether having millions of new products is actually a particularly good idea when we don't have well-defined preferences.
I won't have the last word, but the last question is still for you, Andrew. In the recent CEPREMAP paper, with Jan and Claudia Senik, France appears to be the country with the strongest links, the highest correlation between subjective well-being and disposable incomes. Was it a surprise to you? It was a surprise to me.
A link between, it's much to my embarrassment, I haven't read this one. Oh dear. So this
the highest correlation between individuals, between subjective well-being and disposable incomes. I mean, I just don't think that's true. I should have to tell Claudia that's wrong. No, it depends what you're measuring. It depends what elements you have. I would have thought emotional health would be far more important, as would be physical health, than just the simple level of income. But I'd have to go back and see what they did. But despite what everyone says, it's of course natural that income and well-being are correlated in cross-section. No one disputes that. Yeah, richer people are happier than poorer. The problem is that everyone gets richer. Nobody gets relatively France
richer.
was the country with the highest correlation, and it was pretty surprising to me. Okay.